The cruelest promises are the ones people never realize they've broken. That was the sentence I kept hearing in my head the night everything changed, although at the time I had no idea how perfectly it described my marriage. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Every conversation carried the polished confidence that only wealth could buy. Men in tailored suits laughed over billion-dollar acquisitions. Waiters drifted quietly through the crowd with silver trays balanced effortlessly in their hands. Gideon Mercer stood exactly where everyone expected him to be. He commanded every room without ever raising his voice. At 43, he had built Mercer Global Logistics into a company that reached ports across 3 continents. People treated him less like a businessman and more like a force of nature. Someone lifted a glass toward him with an easy grin. "Tell me you actually keep Sundays free for your wife." The men around them chuckled before Gideon answered. He loosened one cuff, smiled without thinking, and said she still thinks I save Sundays for her. Laughter rolled across the group, warm and effortless. It disappeared into the music before anyone considered what those words actually meant. Gideon laughed too. He accepted another handshake, another compliment, another invitation. The conversation moved on as though nothing important had been said. Nearly 30 miles away, the kitchen windows of our home overlooked the fading blue silhouette of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The sunlight had almost disappeared. It left the marble countertop glowing beneath soft pendant lights. A peach cobbler cooled beside the stove, filling the room with cinnamon and brown sugar. Elise Rowan glanced at the clock above the pantry. It was 6:15. She reached for her phone, not to call him, but to open her calendar. One notification waited patiently on the screen. Final alumni dinner of the year. RSVP confirmed. Her thumb rested over it for several seconds before she quietly selected cancel reservation. The confirmation message appeared almost instantly. She stared at it long enough for the screen to dim. Then she placed the phone face down and walked to the dining table. 2 plates were already waiting, 2 glasses, 2 folded linen napkins. Everything looked exactly the same as it had every Sunday for years. She adjusted 1 fork by less than an inch. She stepped back and looked toward the front door without realizing she had done it. Outside, the driveway remained empty. Her closest friend, Naomi, had texted twice that afternoon. The first message asked if she was finally coming to dinner. The second simply read, "Maybe next month." Elise never answered either one. She picked up the cobbler and carried it carefully to the counter. Steam still rose from the crust, but the room already felt strangely cold. She turned on the old jazz playlist Gideon used to like during their first year of marriage. Soft piano notes drifted through the house, filling spaces that conversation no longer reached. She smiled faintly, almost out of habit. Then she looked back toward the windows as headlights briefly appeared on the road below before disappearing again. Somewhere across town, applause erupted as Gideon accepted another award recognizing his leadership. Cameras flashed. People congratulated him on another remarkable year. He thanked every person who approached him. He remembered names, birthdays, business milestones, and family details for clients he barely knew. Yet he never noticed that every Sunday of his wife's life had quietly become an empty page reserved for him alone. The ballroom continued celebrating while the house settled into silence. The cobbler stopped steaming. The jazz record reached its final song. Elise picked up both dinner plates without a single sigh. She covered the untouched meal and placed it gently inside the refrigerator. Before turning off the kitchen light, she looked once more at the front door. Not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with the calm expression of someone who had repeated the same hope so many times that it had slowly become part of the furniture. Upstairs, her phone lit up one last time. Another invitation disappeared as she pressed decline without reading the details. Then the screen went dark. It left only the reflection of a woman who had quietly canceled everything else because she still believed one Sunday might finally belong to them. Monday mornings always arrived with fresh opportunities for Gideon Mercer, but they always arrived with one invisible cost that he never bothered to calculate. Before 7 o'clock, his driver was already waiting outside the house. The espresso machine hummed softly in the kitchen. The city below the hillside slowly came alive beneath a blanket of pale mountain fog. Gideon buttoned his charcoal suit, glanced at the financial headlines on his tablet, and walked downstairs. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man whose schedule had been planned weeks in advance. He noticed breakfast waiting on the island exactly as it always was. Fresh fruit had been sliced. Toast rested beneath a cloth to keep it warm. Coffee filled his favorite mug without a single drop spilled onto the saucer. He took 2 quick bites, thanked Elise with a distracted smile, and answered a phone call before he reached the front door. The conversation shifted immediately to shipping routes, overseas contracts, and quarterly projections. By the time the front gate closed behind his car, he had already forgotten whether she had said anything before he left. Elise remained standing in the entryway for several seconds after the engine faded into the distance. She looked at the second coffee cup that still sat untouched beside hers. Then she quietly poured it into the sink. She didn't look upset. She simply washed the mug, dried it carefully, and placed it back in the cabinet where it belonged. Later that afternoon, she received another invitation. This time from her younger sister asking if she would spend the coming Sunday visiting their parents outside Hendersonville. Elise smiled gently while reading the message. Her fingers rested above the keyboard. She wanted to say yes. She even imagined the familiar smell of her mother's apple pie and the laughter that always filled the old farmhouse. Instead, she typed the same sentence she had written so many times that it no longer required thought. "I'm sorry, I already have plans this Sunday." She pressed send, although nothing had actually been planned. She simply wanted to leave the day untouched. At the office downtown, Gideon moved effortlessly from one conference room to another. Executives admired his discipline because every minute had a purpose. His assistant, Claire Donovan, noticed one unusual pattern while confirming appointments. Every Sunday remained blocked on his calendar months in advance. She smiled and said, "I still think it's impressive that you protect one day every week for your wife." Gideon barely looked up from the reports spread across his desk. "Most Sundays turn into work anyway," he answered casually. "I just never remember to remove the placeholder." Claire nodded politely, but something about the answer lingered in the silence after she left the room. That evening, Elise opened a small cabinet in the den where several unfinished watercolor paintings rested against the wall. Years earlier, she had painted almost every weekend. The landscapes of western North Carolina had once filled her sketchbooks with color. She pulled one canvas halfway out, studied the unfinished brushstrokes, and then gently slid it back into its place. Dust had settled along the wooden frame. She brushed it away with the sleeve of her sweater before closing the cabinet door. The following Thursday, Naomi called instead of texting. Elise answered immediately, happy to hear her friend's voice. They laughed about college memories, old professors, and a road trip they had once taken together. Then Naomi hesitated. "A few of us are planning brunch this Sunday." "I almost didn't ask, because I already know your answer." Elise looked toward the family calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. The square-marked Sunday remained completely blank, except for a tiny blue circle she had drawn herself weeks ago. She smiled anyway and said, "I can't this weekend." Naomi didn't argue. She simply whispered, "I miss you," before ending the call. Elise stood there for another moment with the silent phone still resting in her hand. She slowly erased the little blue circle from the calendar, then drew another one exactly where it had been, as though renewing a promise that only she still remembered. The seasons changed almost without anyone noticing. Summer mornings slowly gave way to crisp autumn air. The maple trees lining the winding roads outside Asheville traded bright green leaves for deep shades of gold and crimson. Inside the Mercer home, however, the rhythm never seemed to change. Every Sunday still waited quietly for a man who rarely arrived before sunset. Elise stopped expecting surprises long ago. Instead, she became remarkably good at protecting the silence from feeling uncomfortable. She baked less often now, because leftovers always found their way into the refrigerator. She no longer searched for new recipes or folded fresh flowers into the center of the dining table. She simply kept the house peaceful, hoping peace itself might someday become enough. One Wednesday afternoon, Naomi drove past the neighborhood after visiting a nearby client. She decided to stop by without calling first, carrying 2 cups of pumpkin spice coffee from the cafe they both loved years earlier. Elise answered the door with the same warm smile she always wore, but Naomi noticed something had quietly disappeared. The hallway used to display photographs from hiking trips, birthday dinners, and weekend adventures. Now several frames stood empty, their pictures carefully removed and tucked away somewhere unseen. They sat together on the back patio overlooking the distant mountains, while the wind carried scattered leaves across the stone walkway. Naomi laughed about work, neighbors, and mutual friends before finally asking, "Do you ever miss us?" Elise looked toward the empty garden instead of answering immediately. "Sometimes," she admitted softly. "Then why do you keep saying no?" Naomi asked. Elise wrapped both hands around the warm paper cup. "Because if I make plans, that will probably be the Sunday he decides to come home early." Naomi lowered her eyes. There was nothing left to argue. She simply reached across the table, squeezed Elise's hand for a moment, and changed the subject. The following week, another invitation appeared. This time for the monthly alumni dinner that had become a tradition for nearly a decade. The organizer automatically added every familiar name to the guest list except one. Nobody intended to be cruel. They simply assumed she would decline again. Elise never even knew the invitation had existed. Across town, Gideon walked through another successful negotiation inside the company's executive boardroom. Contracts were signed. Investors applauded. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages that arrived faster than he could answer them. During lunch, one of the younger executives mentioned a charity gala scheduled for Sunday afternoon. "I can't make it," another executive replied. "My wife would never forgive me if I gave away another weekend." Everyone laughed lightly before returning to business. Gideon smiled with them, never realizing how different that sentence sounded from the life he was actually living. Later that evening, he returned home just after 9 o'clock. The lights in the living room were still on. Elise sat curled beneath a blanket with an open novel resting across her lap. She looked up as he entered, smiled gently, and asked whether he had eaten dinner. He nodded. She closed the book, wished him a good night, and carried her empty teacup into the kitchen. There had been a time when she would have asked how the meeting went, whether he was tired or if he wanted dessert. This time she asked nothing else. Gideon barely noticed the difference. He answered 2 final emails before going upstairs. As he passed the hallway table, he glanced at a small ceramic bowl that had always collected invitations, greeting cards, and handwritten notes from friends. It was completely empty. He assumed people simply didn't send many invitations anymore. He never imagined they had simply stopped asking, because everyone except him had finally accepted the same quiet truth. Elise was never coming. Winter settled over Asheville with quiet determination. Frost covered the balcony railings each morning, and the mountains beyond the wide living room windows disappeared behind pale gray clouds more often than blue skies. The Mercer house remained as beautiful as ever, yet it no longer felt lived in. It felt maintained. Every room was perfectly arranged. Every light worked. Every shelf stood spotless. But something invisible had begun leaving, long before anyone realized it was gone. Gideon still left before sunrise most weekdays, and often returned after dark. The security staff greeted him with the same respect. The driver opened the same car door. The business reports waiting on his desk grew thicker every month. Success continued arriving exactly on schedule. At home, however, another schedule had quietly disappeared. Sunday morning arrived again, but there was no smell of fresh bread drifting through the kitchen. The jazz playlist that had once welcomed the weekend remained silent. The curtains stayed closed until daylight had almost filled the room. Gideon walked downstairs carrying his phone while answering questions about an overseas shipment delayed by bad weather. He poured himself coffee, paused for a moment, and looked toward the empty breakfast table. There was nothing unusual about it in his mind. He assumed Elise wanted to sleep later. He finished the call, picked up his mug, and disappeared into his home office to continue working. Upstairs, Elise sat near the bedroom window wrapped in a light sweater, with a notebook resting across her knees. She wasn't writing letters or making plans. She had simply begun listing things she used to enjoy before every Sunday belonged to waiting. Watercolor painting, mountain trails after sunrise, farmers markets downtown, brunch with Naomi, and visiting her parents without checking the time every hour. She stared at the list for several minutes before quietly closing the notebook. She didn't cry. She simply placed it inside the bedside drawer and walked downstairs. When she reached the kitchen, Gideon had already returned to another conference call. He lifted one finger politely, signaling that he would be finished soon. She nodded with the same gentle smile she always offered and poured herself tea instead of coffee. Years ago, she would have remained nearby until the call ended. This time she carried the mug into the sunroom and watched snowflakes drift slowly across the backyard. Neither of them noticed how naturally the distance between them had grown. That afternoon, Gideon finally stepped outside his office, expecting lunch together. The dining table had already been cleared. A neatly covered plate waited inside the refrigerator with a handwritten note that simply read, "Heat for 2 minutes." Nothing more. No heart drawn beside her name. No reminder asking him to take a break. No question about whether he enjoyed the meal. He warmed the food, ate while reviewing spreadsheets, and returned to work without giving the note another thought. Elise spent the afternoon organizing shelves inside the small hobby room that had once been filled with paintbrushes and unfinished canvases. She dusted each frame carefully before placing them inside storage boxes. One by one, the colors disappeared into the closet. The room echoed more with every empty shelf. Later that evening, she stood in the hallway and looked toward the piano that Gideon had given her during their second anniversary. It hadn't been opened in months. She gently lowered the protective cover across the keys and locked it for the first time. The soft click echoed farther than she expected. Downstairs, Gideon looked up briefly after hearing the sound, then returned to the contract lying open across his desk. He assumed she had simply finished cleaning another room. Outside, the last light faded behind the mountains, while snow continued falling without a sound. Inside the house, another Sunday tradition had quietly vanished, and no one spoke a single word about it. Spring arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as if the mountains themselves were uncertain whether the long winter had truly ended. The trees surrounding the Mercer home slowly filled with fresh green leaves, and birds returned to the backyard every morning before sunrise. Life outside was beginning again. Inside the house, time still seemed to stand perfectly still. Gideon spent another week moving between airports, boardrooms, and private meetings. Every conversation revolved around expansion, acquisitions, and forecasts for the coming fiscal year. His calendar remained packed from dawn until late evening, every hour assigned to something that appeared important. Then one Thursday afternoon, an unexpected power outage forced the executive offices to shut down for several hours while the building's electrical systems were inspected for the first time in months. Gideon found himself driving home before sunset with no conference calls waiting and no urgent contracts demanding his attention. The house greeted him with unfamiliar silence. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase beside the staircase, and called Elise's name almost automatically. No answer came. He assumed she had stepped outside, looking for something to occupy the unexpected free time. He walked upstairs toward the study they rarely used anymore. A filing cabinet near the window held years of household paperwork that Elise carefully organized every spring. Hoping to find an old property document requested by his accountant, Gideon opened the top drawer. Instead of financial records, he found several neatly stacked planners, each labeled with a different year in Elise's careful handwriting. He pulled one from the middle of the stack and opened it without much thought. The pages were filled with small notes, reminders, birthdays, grocery lists, and appointments written in blue ink. Everything looked ordinary until he reached the Sunday pages. Every single Sunday had been left almost completely empty except for one short sentence written in exactly the same place. Keep the day open. He turned another page, then another year, the same sentence. Different handwriting as the years passed, but always the same words. Keep the day open. There were no lunch reservations, no gallery visits, no family trips, no vacations, no painting classes. Birthdays had been moved to Saturdays. Medical appointments appeared on Fridays. Volunteer events had been scheduled for Mondays. Everything else in her life had quietly shifted away from Sundays. Gideon frowned for the first time that afternoon. He reached for another planner. The pattern continued through every year he opened. Once, a hiking trip had been crossed out with a single careful line. Beside it, she had written, "Maybe next month." A concert ticket had been taped inside another planner, with the words "couldn't go after it." A family reunion had been moved to Saturday because Sunday needed to remain available. Gideon slowly sat down in the leather chair beside the desk. The room suddenly felt much smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. He continued turning pages more slowly now, no longer searching for tax documents or property records. He was searching for an explanation that never came. Every planner told the same quiet story. Elise hadn't accidentally become unavailable on Sundays. She had intentionally built her entire life around the possibility that he might come home. He closed one planner, only to open another almost immediately, hoping to prove himself wrong. Instead, the evidence became impossible to ignore. 6 years of calendars showed a woman rearranging her own life week after week without ever asking for recognition. Gideon rested both hands on the closed planner and stared through the study window toward the mountains beyond the trees. He couldn't remember asking her to do any of it, yet he also couldn't remember ever telling her not to. For the first time in years, a meeting, a contract, and every accomplishment waiting inside his briefcase suddenly felt strangely distant. Downstairs, the front door opened softly as Elise returned carrying a small paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. She placed fresh bread on the kitchen counter. She was completely unaware that upstairs, a stack of ordinary calendars had quietly become the first thing powerful enough to interrupt the life Gideon had spent years believing was perfectly under control. The planners remained on Gideon Mercer's desk long after the afternoon sunlight had faded from the study windows. He didn't open another one. He no longer needed proof. Every page had quietly said the same thing, and every empty Sunday had become heavier than the busiest week of his career. For several minutes, he simply sat there, listening to the silence inside his own home. It sounded different now. He could suddenly hear everything that had disappeared. The music, the laughter from old phone calls, the sound of paintbrushes tapping against a glass jar. Even the faint melody Elise used to play on the piano while waiting for him had been gone for so long that he had forgotten it ever existed. He carefully returned every planner to the drawer exactly as he had found it. He closed the cabinet with unusual gentleness, almost as if he feared making too much noise would somehow disturb the years those pages had quietly protected. Downstairs, Elise unpacked fresh bread from the neighborhood bakery and arranged it beside a small bowl of strawberries. She smiled when Gideon entered the kitchen earlier than expected. "You're home before dinner," she said softly. "The meetings ended sooner than I expected," he replied. His voice sounded unfamiliar, even to himself. He wanted to ask why she had canceled so much of her life. He wanted to ask why she had never told him. Instead, he stood there looking at the bread she was slicing, while realizing she had never been the one keeping secrets. He had simply never looked closely enough to notice the truth. During dinner, neither of them reached for their phones. That alone felt unusual. Rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking the mountains, while the kitchen filled with the warm smell of rosemary and fresh bread. Gideon watched Elise butter a slice before placing it onto his plate exactly the way she had done for years. Her movements were calm, practiced, almost effortless. He wondered how many ordinary acts of kindness had become invisible simply because they happened every day. "Do you have plans this Sunday?" he asked after a long silence. Elise looked up, surprised by the question more than the words themselves. She smiled politely and said, "Not really." It wasn't completely true, but she no longer expected him to remember Sundays anyway. Gideon nodded slowly without saying anything else. That night, after Elise had gone upstairs, he opened his work calendar on the laptop sitting in his office. Every hour of the coming weekend had already been assigned to meetings, conference calls, and a private dinner with investors arriving from Seattle. His fingers rested above the keyboard. One by one, he selected every appointment: cancel, reschedule, decline. His assistant would probably think there had been an emergency. His business partners would certainly be surprised. For the first time in years, Gideon left an entire Sunday completely empty on purpose. He closed the computer and sat quietly in the darkness for several minutes. It felt strangely uncomfortable, as though he had forgotten how to protect time that couldn't produce a profit. Sunday morning arrived beneath bright blue skies after several days of rain. Sunlight poured through the large living room windows, painting soft golden squares across the hardwood floors. Gideon woke earlier than usual and walked downstairs expecting to smell coffee already brewing. The kitchen was spotless. The coffee maker remained off. The dining table stood empty. He looked around the house before noticing a small handwritten note resting beside the fruit bowl. The paper contained only one sentence, written in Elise's familiar handwriting. "I'm finally keeping one Sunday for myself." There was no explanation, no apology, and no complaint. He walked to the front window just in time to see her car disappear down the winding road leading toward town for the first time since they had been married. The Sunday he had finally chosen to come home was the first Sunday she was no longer there waiting for him. The empty house greeted Gideon with a silence he had never experienced before. It wasn't the familiar quiet that usually surrounded a successful weekend filled with unfinished work. This silence belonged to someone who had finally stopped waiting. He folded Elise's note once and slipped it carefully into his wallet instead of leaving it on the kitchen counter. Then he stood beside the living room window for several minutes, watching the winding road disappear into the trees, wondering where she had gone on a Sunday when she had always stayed home. He considered calling her, but his thumb never reached the screen. For years, she had accepted every interruption without complaint. The least he could do now was allow her one uninterrupted day. He walked into the kitchen and noticed things he had ignored countless times before. The fruit bowl had already been refilled. Fresh flowers stood in a simple glass vase near the sink. A small tear had been stitched neatly into one of the dining room chair cushions. None of those things had happened by themselves. Someone had quietly cared for this home while he had been busy caring for everything else. Around noon, Gideon opened the refrigerator and found containers labeled in Elise's careful handwriting: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Every meal had already been prepared for the coming week. She had taken one Sunday for herself, yet she had still made certain he wouldn't have to worry about dinner after work. He closed the refrigerator more slowly than he opened it. Gratitude and regret often arrived together. He was only beginning to recognize the difference between receiving kindness and deserving it. Later that afternoon, his phone vibrated with a call from Claire Donovan. She sounded concerned. The investors from Seattle said they can still meet today if you have an hour. Gideon looked around the quiet house before answering. "Please tell them I'll see them tomorrow morning." Claire paused for a moment. "Tomorrow?" she asked, surprised. "Yes," Gideon replied. "Today belongs somewhere else." After ending the call, he walked into the garage, climbed into his car, and drove toward downtown Asheville without any particular destination in mind. He passed the art district where local galleries displayed colorful paintings beneath brick storefronts. He noticed couples carrying coffee as they wandered slowly through weekend markets. Families sat together on park benches while children chased pigeons across the sidewalks. It struck him that the city had always been full of ordinary Sundays. He had simply never lived one. As evening approached, he returned home before sunset instead of after dark. The driveway remained empty for another hour before Elise's car finally appeared. She stepped out carrying a small paper bag and a pottery bowl wrapped carefully in brown paper. Her cheeks were lightly flushed from the cool mountain air, and there was something different about the way she walked. She didn't appear happier than before. She simply looked lighter. Gideon met her at the front door before she reached for her keys. "How was your day?" he asked. Elise looked mildly surprised. "It was nice," she answered. "I took a beginner pottery class. Then I had coffee with Naomi." Gideon smiled softly. "I hope you enjoyed it." She nodded. "I did." That could have been the end of the conversation. But for the first time in years, he didn't turn away after asking a polite question. Instead, he reached for the grocery bag she was carrying. "Let me help." Elise hesitated for only a second before handing it to him. Inside rested the slightly uneven ceramic bowl she had shaped with her own hands that afternoon. It was far from perfect. One side curved a little higher than the other. The glaze wasn't completely smooth. Gideon held it carefully as though it were made of glass. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Elise looked at the bowl, then back at him. "It's only my first attempt." Gideon smiled again, this time without distraction. Everyone has to begin somewhere. Neither of them realized that he was no longer talking about pottery. The weeks that followed didn't transform their marriage overnight. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no emotional speeches, no impossible promises, and no perfect mornings that erased years of quiet disappointment. Instead, Gideon continued protecting every Sunday on his calendar with the same determination he had once reserved for business deals. Invitations arrived from clients. Charity events were rescheduled. Golf outings with investors appeared and disappeared again after he politely declined them. Claire eventually stopped asking why Sundays were unavailable because the answer never changed. "I already have plans." Sometimes those plans were nothing more than breakfast at home. Sometimes they were an afternoon walk through the neighborhood. Sometimes they became an hour spent reading separate books in the same room. Gideon gradually discovered that presence didn't always require conversation. One Sunday morning, he woke before Elise and quietly prepared coffee, using the same machine she had operated for years, without anyone noticing the routine behind it. The first attempt overflowed onto the counter. The second cup tasted bitter. By the third try, he finally understood why she always measured the coffee grounds instead of guessing. When Elise entered the kitchen, she paused at the sight of 2 steaming mugs waiting beside the window. Gideon looked almost embarrassed. "I think I finally made one that's drinkable." She picked up the cup, took a careful sip, and smiled. "It's better than your first 2 attempts." He laughed softly. "You heard those?" The entire house heard those. They shared a quiet smile before sitting together without rushing anywhere. A few Sundays later, Elise left early for another pottery class. Gideon stayed home instead of following her. He trimmed the hedges that had grown uneven over the winter. He repaired a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen and polished the old piano until the wood reflected the afternoon sunlight again. None of those chores were difficult. What surprised him was realizing how many of them she had quietly handled alone for years. When Elise returned that afternoon carrying another handmade bowl, she noticed the piano first. Her fingers rested gently on the polished surface. "You cleaned it." Gideon nodded. "I thought it deserved better than collecting dust." She opened the lid and pressed a single key. The clear note echoed gently through the living room before fading into silence. She didn't play a song. She simply left the piano open. The following Sunday, they drove separately into town because Elise planned to meet Naomi after her pottery class. Gideon spent the afternoon wandering through a nearby bookstore before buying 2 tickets for a small outdoor concert scheduled later that summer. He almost handed them to Elise that evening, but stopped himself. Years earlier, he would have expected her to rearrange everything for his schedule. This time he waited until she finished reading on the porch. "I found something today," he said, placing the envelope beside her chair. Elise opened it slowly. "There's a concert in July." She looked at him with quiet curiosity. "If you already have plans that day, we don't have to go," Gideon said calmly. "I wanted to ask before I assumed." She stared at the tickets for several long seconds. The words themselves were simple, yet they carried a respect she hadn't realized she missed. He was no longer reserving her time without asking. He was inviting her into his. Elise folded the tickets carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. "I'd like to go," she answered. Neither of them reached across the table. Neither of them tried to force a moment that hadn't fully arrived yet. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees across the porch, while the mountains faded into soft shades of blue beneath the setting sun. Gideon realized that rebuilding trust felt very much like watching daylight disappear. It happened so gradually that most people never noticed the exact moment everything changed. But if you remain patient enough to stay until the end, The entire horizon eventually became something completely different. Nearly a year passed before either of them realized they had stopped measuring time by missed Sundays. The seasons completed another quiet circle around the Blue Ridge Mountains. Summer returned with warm evenings, open windows, and the familiar scent of fresh-cut grass drifting through the neighborhood. The Mercer home looked much the same from the outside, yet it no longer felt like a place built around waiting. It felt like a place where two lives had finally learned to exist beside one another. Instead of revolving around one person's schedule, Elise's pottery shelves slowly filled with handmade bowls, cups, and small vases, each one slightly better than the last. Her watercolor supplies returned to the hobby room, no longer hidden inside dusty boxes. Some Saturdays, she visited her parents. Some Sundays, she met Naomi for coffee before coming home. Gideon never asked her to cancel. He never expected her calendar to remain empty. Instead, he asked simple questions that had once seemed unnecessary. What are your plans? Would you like company? Can we find another day if this one already belongs to you? Those questions changed far more than grand apologies ever could. At the office, Claire noticed another quiet transformation. Gideon still worked hard, but he no longer treated every invitation as an obligation. He delegated more responsibility, left meetings when they had accomplished their purpose, and stopped wearing exhaustion as though it were a badge of honor. One Friday afternoon, an important client suggested moving a negotiation to Sunday because everyone would be available. Gideon smiled politely and declined without hesitation. Monday morning will work just fine. Nobody argued. The world continued turning exactly as it always had. That realization surprised him more than anything else. For years he had believed everything depended on him. It never had. One bright Sunday morning in early July, sunlight poured across the kitchen floor while Elise stood at the counter writing something inside a brand new planner. Gideon noticed the familiar blue cover and paused beside her with 2 cups of coffee. He remembered the old planners hidden inside the study drawer and the 6 years of empty Sundays that had quietly broken his heart. He set 1 cup beside her and looked down at the open page. This time the calendar was full. A pottery workshop appeared on one weekend. Lunch with Naomi filled another. Her parents' anniversary occupied the following Sunday afternoon. A charity fundraiser was scheduled 2 weeks later. Her life had returned, page by page, appointment by appointment. Gideon smiled because the crowded calendar no longer frightened him. It relieved him. Then his eyes stopped on one small square near the end of the month. One Sunday remained marked with a simple handwritten word surrounded by a small blue circle. Together, nothing else. No explanation, no reminder, just one word. Gideon looked at Elise, but she was already smiling, as though she had known he would notice. "I thought we could drive to the overlook after breakfast," she said quietly. "Maybe bring sandwiches this time instead of rushing home." Gideon nodded. "I'd like that very much." They packed lunch into a small basket and drove through the winding mountain roads with the windows open, letting the warm breeze carry away the last traces of a life built on missed moments. At the overlook, they spread a blanket beneath the shade of an old oak tree. There were no urgent phone calls, no business presentations, and no promises about the future. Gideon switched off his phone completely and placed it inside the basket without hesitation. Elise noticed the gesture but said nothing. She simply reached for his hand, as naturally as if no years had ever been lost between them. They watched the mountains stretch across the horizon while clouds drifted slowly overhead. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt earned. Gideon finally understood that love had never been measured by the number of Sundays he believed he had reserved. It had always been measured by whether the person beside him felt seen on every ordinary day in between. And as the afternoon sunlight settled gently across the valley below, neither of them looked at the time, because for the first time in many years, there was nowhere else either of them wanted to be.